Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion about the elections in Turkey. As I think our viewers know, last month there were two rounds of elections in Turkey. On May 14th, tens of millions of Turkish voters delivered a victory to President Erdogan's People's Alliance in the parliament, where they continue to hold a majority, albeit with a somewhat smaller margin. And 2 weeks later, just 2 weeks ago, on May 28th, voters in Turkey returned to the polls to cast the deciding vote in the second round of presidential elections. And this was the first runoff election in the country's history. Turkey's elections have been described as the most important elections of 2023 in recognition of Turkey's growing influence in regional and global affairs. And today we'll talk about the implications of the election at home and abroad, and also about how the election is seen from Germany. And so I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Sinem Adar. She is with the Center for Applied Turkey Studies at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And so, Sinem, thank you so much for joining us. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to this conversation. And I thought we could maybe start by sort of hearing from you whether you were surprised by the election results, and the fact that there were two rounds of elections this time.
Thank you, Stephen, for the invitation. I was surprised that I was not surprised that there was a runoff. There was a second round, but I was definitely surprised that Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, the candidate of the main opposition's bloc, that is the Nations Alliance, was not the leading candidate in the first round. And that has a couple of reasons. First is that Mr. Erdogan's ruling alliance, People Alliance, seemed to be quite fragile going to the elections. And that is, be it because of the economic crisis, be it because of the earthquake that in a way revealed the weaknesses of Erdogan's alliance, and also because of the tensions within Erdogan's alliance among different actors. That it painted a picture of vulnerability, fragility, and weakness. But at the same time, pollsters, most of the pollsters also thought that Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu would be the leading candidate. And I think overall, Kılıçdaroğlu also ran a quite good campaign heading to the first round. So because of all those reasons, I personally thought that he would be the leading candidate and there would be a second round. But it turned out that Mr. Erdogan came out to be the leading candidate in the first round.
So did you have a sense, I mean, if you had a sense that there would be a runoff, but you were a little bit surprised as to how the results of both rounds happened, what did you think would happen in the second round? Or did you think that Erdogan would win?
I think there was, even basically after Erdogan became the leading candidate in the first round, there was still a possibility, although a very low probability, for Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu to win. I thought it was still in the realm of the possible, even by the opposition. But it's, I guess the nationalist votes, I wouldn't call them kingmakers, but that became to be the quite important, again, unlike the expectations before the elections, because I think the general narrative before the elections was that the Kurdish vote would be the kingmaker, but the nationalist votes and the candidate of the third candidate, basically Sinem Adar, became quite of an important figure. Again, I wouldn't call him a kingmaker, but the whole playground, in a way, kind of changed after the first round, heading to the second round.
Yeah. Sinem, since you mentioned the polls a little bit earlier, and that they weren't good guidelines. One of our viewers has a question as to why the polls prior to the election looked much stronger for the opposition. And I guess my question to that would also be whether part of that was sort of a voicing of protest, if you will. But our viewer is also curious whether this says something about the sort of the method of polling, but also the ability to cover the election, or does it say something about Erdogan?
I think the issue with the pollsters and the polling is that it was actually the case in other countries as well, such as Hungary. So they were not really able to accurately pinpoint the results. So I think there is a general problem with polling that goes beyond Turkey. But in this specific case of Turkey, I have the feeling that the indecisive voters and kind of preference falsification might have played a role. And again, in many of the polls, actually, the difference between the two leading candidates was in the margin of error. So the margin of error was actually very big. So I think that's one reason why the polls were not able to pick up predict the results.
Yeah. So of course, after the second round, President Erdogan ended up with just over 52% of the vote, and that basically means that almost half of the electorate did not back Erdogan, and it leads to a conclusion that Turkey is a very polarized country with these two big camps. Can you share with us a little bit how deep some of these divisions are? Because I think that's important as we then start to talk a little bit about how Erdogan might govern, right? I mean, it seems like there are some very deep and fundamental divisions in the country right now.
You are absolutely right. I mean, I think what the election results show is that there are two Turkeys to start with, and both the desire for continuity, but also desire for change are actually quite strong in the country. And one should also, I think, keep in mind that we are talking about a country where the society is kind of like driven by alternative realities, because on the one hand, you have the media landscape, 90% of the media landscape is controlled by the president and companies that are close to him. But on the other hand, the opposition has also over the years created its own media landscape, in which I think both the opposition and the government in a way kind of propagating their own views that divide the population according to these alternative realities. So that's one issue. Now, I think, of course, Mr. Erdogan was in a more advantageous position, mainly because of the fact that he had the control over resources, be it, as I mentioned earlier, the media, be it the state resources, etc. And what it turns out, before I basically kind of go into the details of the polarization, I think he was successful to consolidate a voter coalition through different means. One is the patronage distribution of resources, and we see that, for instance, in the earthquake region, where that the AKP supporters, there was some reporting in the German press that the AKP supporters were, for instance, given more resources and benefits after the earthquake. But that's kind of a long-lasting story in the last 20 years under the AKP rule. But in addition to that, I think he was also, or more successful than I realized during the election campaign, in deploying a quite strong nationalist and misogynist identity politics that, on the one hand, both kind of created a politics of grandeur, if you will, a national grandeur. It's only because of Erdogan and through Erdogan, Turkey can reach up to the level at the international stage that it deserves. But at the same time, because of that nationalist and misogynist identity politics, I think he was also kind of successfully able to play with politics of fear. So if Erdogan leaves, a lot of things will change. Therefore, 52% of the voters chose, in a way, stability over change. But I mean, this is kind of like one level of divisions that exist in the country. But at the same time, I think the opposition was also not able to convince the voters that it has an alternative vision. It has a kind of a substantive vision for Turkey and in terms of where it wants to take Turkey. And one reason why I think the opposition was not able to come up with such story was actually because of the divisions within the opposition itself. And one can think about kind of two levels, and these two levels have historical roots. One is, of course, the Turkish-Kurdish divide, which I think, Mr. Erdogan used it quite powerfully in terms of depicting the opposition in alliance with the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, and that is recognized also by the EU and the US as a terrorist organization. But that was, I think, also kind of a dividing line that remained a dividing line within the opposition, main opposition as well, the so-called Table of Six or the Nations Alliance, the rapprochement between the main opposition party, that is the Republican People's Party, and the Kurdish political party, up until the last day, remained a problem for the opposition or for the actors within the opposition. And at the same time, there was also a strong discontent among, so to speak, the secular voters that the main opposition party, the Republican People's Party, opened its lists in the parliamentary elections to the members of parties that are splinter parties from the AKP, i.e. the former AKP members, be it Ali Babacan's, the former Minister of Economy's Deva Party, or the former Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu's Future Party, for instance. So you have this kind of like different levers that, just to sum up, in addition to the division between the desire for change and desire for stability, you also have these historical fault lines, mainly the fissure between Turkish nationalism and Kurdish nationalism, if you will, and also between the secular and pious voters, constituencies, elites, if you will.
So, you've pointed out that there are many factors that one has to take into consideration, right? There's not just one thing that contributed to Erdogan's victory. But it seems to me, as sort of an outside observer, that it almost seems as if he's unstoppable or unbeatable, because there were several real fundamental crises in Turkey. You talked about the earthquake very briefly. You talked about the slowing economy very briefly, that sort of would have severely harmed almost any other politician. He, definitely emerged with some bruises and some scratches, but he doesn't seem to have been affected pretty badly by the earthquake and the handling of the earthquake, or by the economic slowdown. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of this aura that he seems to have, and this sense that he's almost unstoppable?
Before I come to that, I think actually it begs a more general question about whether leaders in the so-called competitive authoritarian regimes can be defeated via elections. There was a strong belief before the elections that Turkey would be the first example of such a case, but it turns out that obviously it is not. So I think that's kind of like, and that's a more obviously kind of an academic, analytical question that begs, I think, a lot of research to be able to answer. But beyond that, I think that now, if you especially look at the discussions within the Turkish public, there are two views for why Erdogan was not, or Erdogan won again. According to the one view, the candidate of the opposition was a wrong choice in a country where the very concept of a charismatic, strong leader has become kind of a driving force within society. You needed a stronger leader to win against Erdogan, and Kılıçdaroğlu, according to some, was definitely not that leader, not that person. And I can see why people think that way. There might be a truth in it. But at the same time, I think what I said earlier, that the opposition spent so much time and energy because basically what united the opposition together was their opposition to the presidential system. Mm-hmm. And we are talking about really different political parties across the political spectrum. So they came on the basis of their opposition to the presidential system, and they spent quite a lot of time and effort in terms of how they, should they come to power, how they would reform the system and go back to bring Turkey back to a strengthened, what they call a strengthened parliamentary system. And they prepared a document that is as long as, I think, almost 1,000 pages, which could be thought of, for instance, in the German context, which would function as a coalition agreement. And I think that is in itself a noble act, but at the same time, I think there was a little bit of a too quick or too much confidence in the fact that economy, because of the economic crisis, which is really deep and bad, that Erdogan would definitely lose. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen. And actually there were, if you look at, for instance, historical cases around the world, Indonesia, Malaysia in 1997 is a perfect example of it. Economic crisis doesn't necessarily bring an authoritarian leader or an authoritarian government down. And here I think Erdogan was really able to focus, and he's a master in that, winning an election. He really focused on mobilizing discourse, narrative, resources towards consolidating a voter coalition that is composed of small and medium-sized enterprises, a voter coalition that is composed of workers, for instance. Bear in mind that unemployment, despite the very bad economic woes in the country, unemployment rate hasn't declined in the last 3 years, quite the opposite. Erdogan was able to create 3 million jobs in the last 3 years. So those are, I think, elements, and he was able to also convince, I think, because one of the slogans of the election campaign is that whatever I did before is proof to whatever I will do in the coming 5 years. And I promise my voters and the citizens of Turkey that I will bring Turkey, as I said earlier, to the level that it deserves at the international stage. And I think this kind of narrative, after 2 decades of AKP rule, against the backdrop of the economic growth in the 2000s, against the backdrop of a growing defense industry, for instance, it's contributed to it basically strengthen the hand of Mr. Erdogan.
So I'd like to come to sort of Erdogan and his governing in just a moment, but I'd like to stick with the opposition for just a minute or two, because we've had a couple of questions from viewers who are asking about the opposition. You talked about the fact that the opposition didn't really have a charismatic leader, and one of the questions is whether there might be a leadership change, but you also talked about sort of the piecemeal makeup of the opposition groups. And so one of our viewers is curious about sort of the leadership of the opposition and finding out who might lead, because the parties have not been doing very well in previous elections. But someone else is also curious sort of what we can read into civil society in Turkey when it comes to an opposition party that's not able to be successful against Erdogan.
I mean, I think one question that at the moment remains open is that whether the opposition's alliance, and bear in mind that Turkey will have local elections in March 2024, and the campaigning, at least on the side of the Mr. Erdogan's alliance, has already started for the local elections. The opposition seems to be quite divided, and it seems like they really do not know how to move forward, to be very frank. And that obviously begs the question whether the table of 6 or the nation's alliance will remain intact. And it looks like it might not. There are already some indications that the parties might actually run in the local elections alone, not necessarily in the context of the table of 6. And one, I think, across the political spectrum, I think, not only for the parties within the table of six, but also for the Kurdish political party, for instance, which ran in the election together with the Green Left Party, that all of the parties are kind of hit by the election results and is in a process of, so to speak, soul searching. What comes out of it, we will see, especially regarding the main opposition party, for instance, there is serious criticism that the party itself actually lacks democratic channels. That Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu seems to be really kind of sticking to the leadership position within the party. And what it says about actually the future of democracy in Turkey, if the political parties themselves, the opposition parties themselves, lacks those democratic understanding and democratic channels within the parties, what it means for the future of democracy. Coming to civil society, I think one clear point that this election, both the campaign, but also in a way the outcome shows, is that the societal opposition is definitely ahead of political parties in Turkey, but without well-organized political opposition that has strong ties with the society, because none of these opposition parties actually, except for the Kurdish party, has very kind of substantive, deep-running grassroots organizations. And that's one success of the ruling AKP, because there was a reporting in the Financial Times, if I'm not mistaken, last week. AKP has 11 million members. Compared to that, the main opposition party, Republican People's Party, has only 1.5 million members. Yeah. So that's a huge gap and difference between those two parties. Therefore, what I'm trying to say is that given both the divisions, but also the kind of the confusion within the opposition parties, I think even though civil society still remains strong in Turkey, without having that connection between the political parties and the societal opposition, I think the future, at least to me, doesn't look very bright. Let me end with that kind of pessimistic note. Yeah.
But particularly in light of that pessimism, and you mentioned the local elections in March of next year, right? So that's not far away at all. One of our viewers is curious how Erdogan, but let me also add how the opposition might navigate this incredible polarization that we're seeing based on the election results that we just witnessed last month. Do you think that Erdogan will try to close that gap, or do you think he will actually play on that? Do you think his party will play on that?
The way I see it is that, and this is not new, it has been in circulation in pro-government media by government officials since 2018, if not even earlier, the desire to kind of bring the opposition into line, align the opposition with the government. So in a way, kind of creating a systemic opposition, like in Russia. I think that seems to be that now the kind of the strategic goal of Mr. Erdogan and his alliance. And of course, the situation within the opposition parties contributes to that helps. I think that effort to, for Erdogan to realize his strategic goal. Now, most of the opposition parties will be having party congresses starting from summer onwards, and we'll see what comes out of it. But I think at the moment, what is really critical for the future of democracy in Turkey is for the opposition to maintain, if not strengthen, its capacity to challenge in substantive terms, Mr. Erdogan's role, because despite and I guess we will talk about this, despite the signals towards moderation, for instance, the mindset is the same. The mindset is the same, the system is the same, there are no checks and balances in the system, the power is personalized and centralized in the hands of the president, despite fragmentations within the regime, etc. Therefore, I think as far as the autocratic parameters of the system are concerned, they are there to stay.
Mm-hmm. So one last question about the elections last month, and it's a question that I had, but one of our viewers asks it as well. Were the elections fair and free, and did voters have any problems at the polls?
There were irregularities, definitely, on the day of the election. In the first round, for instance, there was reporting, especially in the Kurdish cities, that the votes for the Kurdish party was kind of registered for the ultra-nationalist MHP, but then the Kurdish political party objected to this, and they were able to change the registration, the numbers. So there were definitely irregularities. As far as whether the elections were free and fair, they were definitely not fair, and that because of the reasons we already talked about, that Erdogan's control over public resources, over the media. Just to give a very quick example that is very telling, Erdogan himself got, as if I remember correctly, I think around like 40 minutes, probably more, of coverage in the national broadcaster, for instance, whereby Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu got only 2 minutes during the election campaign. So that's kind of like I think a very striking example of the fact that that was not a fair election. I also think that it was not a free election, although in the public, both, especially in the Western public, there was the kind of the narrative that the election was not fair, but it was free. I mean, of course, as far as the counting of the votes and so on, no one was kind of holding the voters from not going to the ballot box and not voting, etc., or voting in a certain way. But if you kind of think of the environment of propaganda and what we talked earlier, these kind of the manufactured realities. So I think against that backdrop, it is, to me, it sounds really misleading to call the election free. So it goes hand in hand with the unfair character of the election. So it wasn't fair, it wasn't free election. There were irregularities, but at the same time, I personally do not think that the irregularities would change with the result. It might have reduced the margin, but it wouldn't change the result in favor of the opposition's candidate.
So that's a good segue to actually talk about the future, right? And about what to expect. And so I'm curious if you have any sense of how Erdogan might rule after this very close election, which he won, but it was still a close election. He has to recognize that his country is polarized and is divided. So do you have any thoughts on how he might rule and whether anything will be different?
It was close, you are right, but at the same time, if you also think about the outcome of the parliamentary elections, and that I think is more of a perhaps surprise than the presidential election itself, because the opposition's alliance was quite confident that they will get the majority, and even if they do not get the parliamentary majority, it will be head-to-head. And it's not the case. Mr. Erdogan and his alliance was able to win 322 seats, which is basically a simple majority. And they are only short of 38 seats to take a constitutional, constitutional change to a referendum. And I don't think they will have any difficulty finding those 38 seats. Therefore, I think even though the margin between Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu is not very big, given that the People's Alliance has the majority in the parliament, that I think eases Erdogan's hands with respect to a lot of issues. But at the same time, economy is obviously the burning issue. The central bank has almost no reserves left, and for I'm sure, or for those of you who might be following, that the Turkish lira has been devaluing in the last couple of days quite rapidly, and that seems to be a conscious decision by the policymakers. And now, of course, if you look at the composition of the cabinet, particularly the choice of the Minister of Finance, that says something. That says something in the sense that Erdogan is willing to repair the economic woes. And of course, most of it is his own doing in the context of what we talked earlier, that most of the economic woes are consequences of Mr. Erdogan's election economy. But now we know that he's quite able or known with his tactical U-turns. It looks like there is a tactical U-turn here. And there will be some moderation when it comes to the economic policies. Having said that, given the structural constraints such as personalization of power, the lack of independence of the central bank, competing interests among the business groups, as well as the coming local election, which necessitates an election economy again, to what extent he will be able to overcome these structural constraints and really go hard with orthodox policies, that to me remains to be seen. I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and we'll see how both the new Minister of Finance, but also the new head of the central bank, because today there is a new head of the central bank appointed who is apparently well known in the US. She was working in the financial, I think, Goldman Sachs, etc. So we'll see. And on the 22nd of June, if I'm not mistaken, the central bank will announce the interest rates. And that will, I think, give an indication about how far Mr. Erdogan is able and is willing to go as far as repairing the economy.
So I think all of us are very curious as to how Erdogan will meet the economic challenges that Turkey faces right now. And your comment about the new Treasury and Finance Minister, Mehmet Şimşek, I think is an important insight. He's somebody who comes with a lot of practical experience and has actually been quite opposed to some of the policy prescriptions that Erdogan has made in the past. So it's interesting, that's an interesting choice for Erdogan to make at this time, because I think there are a lot of people who are curious as to whether he might be moving in a more authoritarian, more autocratic direction, as opposed to one that's really trying to address some of the problems at hand. So I'm curious, how do you reconcile sort of these two parts of Erdogan, if you will?
As I said, I think it's the economy is really the most burning issue on the table, and no matter what, he needs to find resources, because given that Turkey doesn't have its own natural resources, and that might, in this situation, be actually an advantage for the future of Turkish democracy, that Erdogan really needs to make these tactical U-turns. But at the same time, if you look at both the narrative and also the kind of the composition of the cabinet, particularly concerning, for instance, the new Minister of Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, I'm not very sure whether there will be a kind of a substantive U-turn in terms of U-turn away from the autocratic and authoritarian kind of tendencies, because it's actually interesting, because you see now when you look at the new cabinet, the first thing one sees is that Erdogan was able to, for instance, sideline his main contenders within the alliance, such as the former Minister of Interior, Süleyman Soylu, who was heavily backed by the junior partner of the alliance, i.e. the ultranationalist party, which basically kind of begs the question, okay, what's really happening here? How was he able to sideline his main contender? And the cabinet is composed of technocrats and people that he really trusts. So it's kind of like he was able to bring his inner circle to the cabinet, and he will be running in the 5 years with this inner circle. But I think that also might indicate, in addition to the tactical U-turn or tactical motivation to repair the economic woes, I think there is also a strategic motivation behind this cabinet, and that has to do with the aspiration to consolidate the system. Therefore, we might see attempts towards moderation, but I don't think that there is kind of change in mind when it comes to the autocratic and the authoritarian tendencies, both in domestic politics, but also in foreign policy, I would say.
So we'll get to foreign policy in just a minute. I guess I have one other question for you related to domestic policy based on some of the things that I was reading after the election and in anticipation of our conversation today. And that was, some experts were saying that there could be a new constitution on the horizon, right? This could be an opportunity for Erdogan to, as you suggest, to really consolidate his power and make some fundamental changes. What's your sense? Do you think that there could be a new constitution for Turkey?
There could be. And as I said earlier, he's only short of 38 seats to take constitutional change to the referendum. And there are already signals from the former AKP members who later on formed their own parties that they would be willing to support such a constitutional change. So it is possible, I think, given the arithmetics in the parliament.
So let's sort of widen our view a little bit and look at the world stage. I mean, again, this is considered to be an incredibly important election this year because of Turkey's geographic location, because of Turkey's role in global affairs. And so what do you think we can expect from, in a sense, a newly emboldened Erdogan on the international stage?
On the one hand, going back to the discussion about the cabinet and the tactical motivations behind selecting, for instance, Mehmet Şimşek as the Minister of Treasury and Finance, I think on the one hand, mainly again because of the economic crisis, Erdogan seems to be willing to come closer to Turkey's Western allies, because that's also, even that Turkish economy is heavily embedded in particularly the European economic structures and networks, that also makes sense. And again, even though there has been a significant rapprochement with Russia in the last decade, you still see that, for instance, the Netherlands is Turkey's #1 foreign direct investor. So the Turkey's economy is heavily tied to European economy. Therefore, on the one hand, I think Mr. Erdogan is looking at Turkey's Western allies. But at the same time, he's also determined to go ahead with the so-called quote-unquote strategic autonomy or independent foreign policy making, as the new Minister of Foreign Affairs called it 2 days ago, the national foreign policy. That means that Turkey will continue to kind of prioritize its own interests. And bear in mind that at the center of Mr. Erdogan's election campaign was the discourse on Turkish century. And we are entering into the second century of the Turkish Republic. So he has this kind of, if you will, almost like a revolutionary view of, I think, what he wants to do and where he wants to take Turkey on the international stage. I think he promised during the election campaign to his voters that under his rule, Turkey will reach a stage at which he will be able to play hardball at the same level with other global players. So I think that kind of aspirations will continue. Now, whether the aspirations will become a reality, that's a completely separate question. And I think over the last Since 2016, we have been increasingly witnessing this increasing gap between the aspirations and actually the reality, the capacity of Turkey to realize these aspirations. And therefore, I think it's realistic to expect that in the coming 5 years, the foreign policy will basically be based on kind of this autonomous foreign policy conduct, combining both soft and hard power instruments. And I think there will be a lot of emphasis on Central Asia and Caucasus. Mm-hmm. And also because of the geopolitical imperatives of the time, because of the war, and part of this has to do with the security issues, and part of it also has to do with the economic issues because of the relocation of the supply chains, etc. I think Turkey is really already before the election there were significant steps taken towards a lot of strategic defense agreements, military cooperation agreements with, for instance, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, etc. So those will continue. And the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, he comes from an academic background. If you look at his some of the pieces that he wrote back in the late 2000s, for instance, most of them are about Eurasia. So I think Eurasia as a kind of both as a political and geographical imagination, but also as a field of policy making is an important space for him.
Mm-hmm. So, obviously there's a lot to unpack there, and there are many different bilateral relationships and regional relationships. And I'd like to, pick out a couple of different threads. A few of our viewers have asked questions that relate to Russia and to the war in Ukraine. One of our viewers is curious whether you think that there's a greater or a lesser likelihood that Turkey will cooperate with the United States and the EU on sanctions regarding Russia, and sort of how you see that unfolding. And someone else is curious to know how we in the West can reconcile the fact that Erdogan is likely to maintain his ties to Vladimir Putin, while at the same time being a NATO member and supplying weapons to Ukraine. So can you maybe help us unpack a little bit this very complicated relationship that Erdogan seems to have with Putin, and Turkey's relationship with Russia?
I think the so-called Turkish balancing act will continue in the coming years. And that basically means that Turkey will continue to support Ukraine. And bear in mind that Turkey sees Ukraine actually as a strategic partner, especially when it comes to defense relations. And has also quite strong economic relations with Ukraine. So that relationship will continue. But at the same time, Turkey's relation with Russia will also continue. Put everything aside against the backdrop of the fact that Turkey's economic dependency on Russia has significantly increased in the last 5 to 6 years. And I think even more so since the war started. Because I think, if anything, the war has shown that one thing about the energy markets, that despite the sanctions, Russia can find other buyers. And obviously, Turkey has already been a buyer of Russian energy sources, but it has significantly increased. And Putin has been also a strong supporter of Mr. Erdogan during the election campaign, be it by, for instance, postponing the gas payments of BOTAŞ, the Turkish National Gas Agency, energy agency, and so on. So that being said, that balancing act will continue because Turkey has relations with both countries. Now, will Turkey join the West's sanctions regime? No, definitely not, because as a principle, and not only of the Erdogan government, I think even if the opposition won the elections, that Ankara wouldn't have joined the sanctions regime, because as a principle, the ruling elites and in general the political class in Turkey keep emphasizing that they, as a principle, they only support sanctions when they are implemented, when the decision comes as a United Nations decision. So kind of the logic is that, well, if we do not partake in the decision-making process, then we will also not support that, or we have the liberty not to partake in the decision or support the decision. I guess one difference between the government and the opposition would be, should the opposition win the election, I think the question about Turkey helping Russia circumventing sanctions would not be a question anymore on the table. With the current government, it will remain a question. And I think when it comes to Turkey being a NATO member, but at the same time having quite close relations, be it in the realm of economy, but also with the purchase of the S-400s, and now with the nuclear central Akkuyu, in different realms in the security and defense cooperation as well with Russia. One thing is that Turkey sees Russia as a rival and at the same time as a threat. So I think that's kind of like important to keep in mind. And both Turkey's NATO membership and Turkey's relations with Russia, I think, should be interpreted and thought of in the context of Turkey's larger aspirations to position itself as a regional power and a global player, if possible. And that being said, now NATO member, I think Mr. Erdogan actually doesn't want to depart from the West, quite the opposite. I think it wants to compete with the West as an equal. And Turkey's NATO membership is actually one of the strongest leverages, according to Mr. Erdogan, that Turkey has in order to be able to conduct an autonomous foreign policy. Also for Russia, Turkey outside of NATO will not be an equally important actor for Russia as well. And just like one last point, I made it a little bit too complicated, but in terms of Turkey's Russia policy, I think Turkey wants neither a strong Russia nor a weak Russia. Because a strong Russia, as I said, because of the fact that in the Black Sea, especially in the Black Sea region and the Caucasus and Central Asia, that would be a threat, a very strong Russia, because Turkey also is very strong on regionalism and sees Black Sea as a regional sea. Therefore, only the littoral states should basically be an actor in Black Sea, etc., etc. But at the same time, it also doesn't want a weak Russia, because a weak Russia actually would weaken Turkey's hand within NATO. And how the West should deal with it, that's a difficult question. I guess one starting point is that Turkey's agency should be accepted. Now, what the Western allies do with that agency is a completely different question, but I think that should be the starting point, that agency should be accepted. And at the same time, I think one also needs to kind of save Turkey from Turkey and see the kind of the global trends, because I think Turkey is not the only fence sitter, or the swing state, so to speak. So there is a kind of like a general trend here. And that has to do with, in my opinion, the changing kind of like the geopolitical dynamics and the reconfiguration of actors, etc., etc. So I will stop there because I made it too long.
No, this is great. And there's a lot there. There's a lot to come back to. And I'd maybe like to fold in two viewer questions that relate to this a little bit. Since you were talking about NATO, one of our viewers is curious whether you think Turkey will approve Sweden's NATO membership application by the NATO summit in July, or if you think this is going to continue to be sort of a sticking point.
Eventually it will. Whether it will happen by the NATO summit in July, that I don't know. It looks like it might, because there are already indications that like the points for agreement are kind of like coming slowly but surely. Be it, for instance, the Sweden's new terror law, which might be a point of kind of satisfaction for Turkey, since that's one point that they were pushing for. Another point that basically increases the likelihood that Ankara might ratify the membership before the summit in July is, I think, Sweden agreed to extradite one PKK member. But ultimately, I think more than what Sweden does, it boils down to what happens between the US and Turkey. And I think, let's wait and see, I would say. Eventually, it will ratify it, but whether it will happen before the summit, I'm not sure.
We'll just have to wait and see. So I was planning to ask you about sort of the level of trust in Erdogan, both at home and abroad. And one of our viewers has a bit of a take on that question. This viewer writes that Turkey, of course, was a founding member of the United Nations, and in that capacity has actively and significantly contributed to facilitating effective implementation of the UN mandate, ranging from peacekeeping and peace building to improving the lives and livelihoods of the poor worldwide. And so the question that's then posed is, how does Turkey maintain this reputation with Erdogan in power?
It's interesting. After the runoff on 28th of May, the Communist Party in Brazil tweeted celebrating Erdogan's victory and saying that the victory of Erdogan is a defeat of imperialism in the Middle East, which is interesting. And I immediately thought, when I read the tweet, in German, there is the word Putin verstehe, though that we might actually soon we might end up with the word Erdogan verstehe.
Now, people who are sympathetic to Putin or sympathetic to Erdogan.
Exactly. And I mean, up until recently, I thought it was mostly within the Middle East and Africa. And that is against the backdrop of Erdogan's kind of claim and aspiration to position Turkey as the leader of the Sunni world. And there he, I think, at the rhetorical level, skillfully combines a discourse of third worldism with a discourse of anti-imperialism. That kind of like, it appears to be appealing to the masses on the Arab street, so to speak. And there, I think he uses his kind of like confrontational style against the West is an important kind of talking point and an important pillar of this appeal. And again, this kind of the defense industry, for instance, I'll come back to that, which I mentioned earlier. I mean, obviously, Turkish citizens take a lot of pride in that, but it looks like it goes beyond Turkish citizens. So this Turkish foreign policy activism and the talking such as the world is bigger than the five, referring to the UN Security Council, or the ability to play the mediating role in the Ukraine war between Ukraine and Russia, UN grain deal, for instance, the mediating the deal, etc., etc. So I think they all kind of contribute to the image of Erdogan and Turkey under Erdogan's rule as the kind of the protector of the vulnerable and the marginalized. And of course, there is a systematic effort, I think, by the government to kind of spread that narrative as well. It might not be as successful as the Russian propaganda, but there is an attempt to do that. So I think in certain parts of the world, Turkey's appearance and Turkey's kind of position in the international stage is very much welcomed and appreciated, to the extent that, for instance, in the northwest of Syria, the night of the election, the 28th of May, the Erdogan victory was also heavily celebrated. So I think certain actors in different parts of the world, in a way, look at Erdogan as a kind of a symbol of a kind of this, the leader of the global south, the third world, this actor, etc., etc. So whether he's able to mobilize these people, it's a completely different story, I think, and I don't think he is. But at the rhetorical level, there is an appeal, definitely.
Sinem, we're running out of time, and I want to come back to sort of one of the starting points that we had. You're based in Germany, and I'm very curious to hear from you sort of how Berlin responded to, how Germany responded to the election results, and what your thoughts are about the relationship between Berlin and Ankara moving forward.
I think, as was the case with many Western allies, the response was pragmatic, I would say. And in the specific case of Germany, because of different reasons, because of the depth of the economic relations, because of the history of migration from Turkey to Germany, i.e. people-to-people contact, a functioning relationship with Turkey is very desirable. And I think the political actors are of the awareness that they need to adopt a pragmatic and a transactional approach with the current government in Ankara, and they will do so. And obviously, I think the war has changed a lot of things. And that's also why a lot of European leaders, including Olaf Scholz himself, was quite eager again on the night of the second round to congratulate Erdogan. But that has to do with, and Ankara is very much aware of it, aware of the first and foremost the security imperatives, but also the geo-economic necessities that come with it. So I think there is interests overlap, or there are certain areas where interests overlap, and especially in the case of Germany and Europe, of course, migration is another file that I think bring Turkey close with Germany and the EU in general. So there is an awareness on both sides that there are overlapping interests. And of course, in relations with Germany and in relations with the EU, the membership process is, I think, a stumbling block, because then it's really difficult to you need to somehow find a way to reconcile values with interests, etc. What will happen with that, we will see.
But do you even think that, I mean, I'm sorry, but I have to ask this, do you even think that Turkey under Erdogan's leadership is interested in membership in the EU at this point?
No, he's not, but he will also not, at the discursive level, he appears every now and then, because he brings up the membership issue, because I think it's, again, kind of, that discourse provides some empowerment, but substantively, no. I think Erdogan and his alliance is interested in a transactional and compartmentalized relationship, both with the EU, but also with the US.
Yeah. Well, Sinem, many thanks for talking with us about these truly fascinating election results, and for giving us your take of the implications of the election results, both within Turkey, but also in terms of Turkey's place on the international stage. I would love to have you back in a few months, because I think that it will be very interesting to watch how Erdogan and his new cabinet sort of take hold, and we can see whether some of the projections that you've made come true or not.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. That was a terrific discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, a big thanks to all of our viewers for tuning in today and for sharing some wonderful questions in today's discussion.